Aloha! I'd like to welcome all of you here today. So thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Kathryn Taketa-Wong, and I'm a naturopathic physician and acupuncturist. And for those of you who aren't familiar with naturopathic physicians, I'd just like to explain a little bit in the beginning before we get started with our topic for today. So for those of you, again, who aren't familiar with naturopathic physicians, we're trained as primary care physicians, and as such, I can order lab tests, do physical exams, write prescriptions, just like any other conventional doctor. However, a big difference is that naturopathic doctors are trained in using diet, vitamins, herbs, and other types of natural medicines to help address the underlying causes of disease and treat the whole person. We have a big emphasis in really looking at the connection between mental emotional health and a connection between all the different systems in the body. So for example, a lot of people don't realize that there's a big connection between the gut and the brain. And that's some of the things that we'll be talking about today in terms of focus with improving our children's diets and what they're eating, but also how that can affect their brain and many other things as well. So we'll be getting into that a little bit more later on. And I also have a master's degree in Oriental medicine, which allows me to include Chinese medicine and acupuncture in my treatment protocols. So one more thing before we begin, if you have any health concerns that you'd like to talk with me about, we do offer a no-charge phone consultation. The 15-minute phone consultation is where we can talk about your condition and come up with a plan to see how I can help you the most. Arranging a phone consultation is very easy. Just call our office at 808-425-2987 and let our staff know that you're interested in a no-charge phone consultation. So to get started, our topic for today is how to help improve our kids' diets and getting healthier foods into our kids. And I'm also going to be talking first about the why, like why we should get healthier foods into our kids, and what exactly does it really mean to have a healthy diet, and what kind of foods are actually healthy, because I see a lot of families that come in where they say, my child eats pretty healthy, and then when I ask them what their child's eating for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it may not actually be that healthy, and a lot of families think their children are eating healthy, but then you may not realize that there are other types of things that are in their diet that are really not good for them. So I'll get into the what and then the why, and then at the very end I'll talk about the how, because that can be the challenging thing, is to actually be able to get healthy foods into our kids. So let's get started. And do feel free to use the comment section to ask questions as the talk progresses. So if you have questions that pop up, then I'll try to go ahead and answer those during the talk. So just to get started on the what is healthy food? So when I talk to parents about improving the quality of what their child is eating, the first thing I usually talk about is trying to decrease or remove most processed foods. So we hear that term a lot, but what exactly is processed food? Well, in simple terms, processed food is basically just food that is more processed. So it's basically food that has been altered in some way from its natural form. And so, for example, a simple example of that might be that, there's an apple. So an apple would be the most natural form of the food. But then you may have applesauce where there's been, so there's some types of applesauce where it's just the apple that has been pulverized to make a sauce type of form, which is not too bad. But there are other types of applesauce where they may add oftentimes preservatives are added to applesauce, and then there may be dyes, there may be extra sugar, artificial flavors, all types of other things may be added. And so that's one example of a slightly more processed food. So, and in general, trying to get our kids to eat food that, and not just our kids, but us as well as adults, to eat food as much as possible in its natural state. So getting the food as close as possible to the way that it exists in nature. So rather than giving your child applesauce, trying to give them an apple is a simple example. But there's a lot of other things beyond that. So processed foods, in general, what I say is, trying to avoid foods that have especially dyes, artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, nitrates, preservatives. So all of these additives can present problems for a number of our kids, and they're not healthy. And it can be difficult to avoid all of these things, but definitely the dyes, artificial flavors, and I'll get a little bit more into those. So dyes, artificial flavors, what's wrong with those? So I do see a number of children that have ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or maybe they don't have an ADHD diagnosis, but they're extremely hyperactive. They might have behavior problems. They might have issues with defiance or mood issues, other types of things. And there's a type of diet called the Feingold diet. It's spelled Feingold. So Dr. Feingold was a physician who found and observed that for some children, it seemed that dyes and artificial sweeteners, artificial flavors, other types of additives like preservatives, nitrates, seemed to be associated with an increased incidence of ADHD, so difficulty with attention and focus, hyperactivity, and also behavior problems. And he found that for a number of these children, when they had foods where these things were taken out of their diet, that they had better behavior. They had better attention, focus, and that's not the case for all children. But, so I do see a number of children with ADHD where maybe they don't have any of those things in their diet, and, they still have difficulty with attention and focus or other things. So there's a number of other things that can contribute to it. So diet is not the only thing. And definitely if you have a friend, who has a child with ADHD, don't blame it on their diet, because you really don't know unless you're in their shoes yourself. But one thing is that for a number of children, diet can help. I've seen everything from some children where in the best case scenario, they take those foods out and the child's ADHD just completely disappears, and they really don't seem to have issues with hyperactivity or focus or attention anymore. And there's other children where maybe their ADHD doesn't completely resolve, but I do see improvements in behavior, attention, focus, a lot of those different things. So those are certainly things to look at. Artificial sweeteners, so that includes things like saccharin, aspartame, which is NutraSweet, sucralose, which is Splenda. So a lot of these artificial sweeteners have been touted as good for diabetics and healthier because, they don't actually contain actual sugar. It's not recognized by the body as sugar. And there are a number of foods, juices, sauces, a lot of different foods that have artificial sweeteners added. And you may not even think that it does until you read the label. So that's why reading labels is really important. Why are artificial sweeteners an issue? So there are a number of studies that are actually finding that artificial sweeteners are really not better for us. And I have a lot of friends, a lot of people that I know that maybe they're diabetic and then they just get sugar-free everything. They say, okay, well, it's fine. I can drink because it's sugar-free. But all of these things that have labeled sugar-free most of the time have artificial sweeteners added. And there's a number of studies that find that actually artificial sweeteners may actually contribute and worsen our body's ability to be able to regulate the blood sugar on our own. And so there's studies finding that artificial sweeteners, there was one study where they took some people who had normal blood sugar, and then they had those people drink artificially sweetened sodas every day for a period of several weeks. And then they retested their blood sugar and found that a number of them actually had prediabetes or started to have impairments in their blood sugar. And there's a number of other similar studies that find that artificial sweeteners really aren't better for us. So I really, really encourage people to avoid artificial sweeteners. And especially actually if you have diabetes or prediabetes. And so what type of sweeteners are okay. I usually will recommend, trying to use small amounts of honey, 100% natural, 100% pure maple syrup, in small amounts. If you do need to use a sweetener, those are, of course, still sugars, though, so that can still be an issue. There are some sweeteners like stevia. Stevia is from a leaf, and so that's something that is helpful. Xylitol is another one. Sometimes xylitol can be problematic for some people, but for the most part, xylitol, erythritol are usually okay. So those are some sweeteners that I'll often recommend. Again, keeping in mind that every person's body is different. Some people may have issues with those. And nitrates, so a lot of our processed meats, so cold cuts, sausages, Portuguese sausage, especially here in Hawaii, Spam, hot dogs, a lot of the processed meats, they contain often nitrates and nitrites. Also beef jerky, a lot of those do contain nitrates and nitrites. So these are things that they use to preserve the meats, but nitrates and nitrites have been associated with an increased risk for stomach cancer and also colon cancer. So those are things, especially cold cuts. There are a lot of kids that they get a sandwich when they have a lunch, and then they use cold cuts. And a lot of the cold cuts, if they don't specifically say nitrate or nitrate free, a lot of them do use nitrates. So that's something to look for in the label, where it says sodium nitrite or sodium nitrate. So there are sausages and other types of processed meats that don't have nitrates or nitrites. Ideally, you just want to have something that just has the meat and then has something like salt and then maybe some herbs or things like that. But that's why that's an issue. And colon cancer, there's been a very concerning increase in the incidence of colon cancer among younger people. So decades ago, colon cancer used to be a disease that was primarily diagnosed among people that were in their 50s or 60s or older. But in the last few decades, there's been a very concerning increase in the number of people who have colon cancer that are being diagnosed in their 30s and even in their 20s. And they're linking that to the increase in the intake of processed foods among our younger children and our younger generation. So particularly the nitrates and the nitrites, but also just lack of fiber, not getting enough fruits and vegetables, and just eating processed foods, which would be like bread and meat and processed meats and things like that, not getting fruits and vegetables is associated with an increased risk for colon cancer. And so that's another reason to try to avoid nitrates and nitrates. And then preservatives. Preservatives can be very hard to avoid, but for the most part, if you're making your own food or trying to just get foods in their natural form, like fruits, like an apple or something like that, then they shouldn't have preservatives. And so preservatives can be an issue for some children, again, in terms of contributing to behavior issues. With the Feingold diet, they recommend avoiding preservatives as well. And that can contribute sometimes in some kids to difficulty with focus and attention, other types of things. So a lot of our kids are also addicted to fast foods, McDonald's, ice cream sundae. A lot of our kids' snacks are really, really unhealthy. So a lot of the kids' cereals are chock full of sugar, artificial sweeteners, preservatives, dyes, gummy snacks that have dyes, and crackers and things that have dyes and artificial flavors, and all of these that can be a risk for issues, and they're not natural. So they're even if your child doesn't have difficulty with attention or focus or hyperactivity, I mean, they're just things that aren't good for us. So it's better to try to get those foods out of the diet. And I see a number of I have families fill out an intake form often when they bring their child in, and the typical American diet, a lot of children are for breakfast they might have cold cereal and milk, with a lot of like some of the processed sugary foods like Fruit Loops, and then Portuguese sausage and rice, and then for lunch they might have chips and a sandwich with cold cuts and cheese. And then for dinner, they might have Portuguese sausage, eggs, and rice, or spaghetti, or Chilean rice, but really hardly any vegetables, hardly any fruits. So that's something that we really need to work on changing in our kids, especially in the standard American diet. And so the main focus in terms of just the basics of trying to improve the diet is trying to get away from so many processed foods and really just trying to get more vegetables, more colorful foods, naturally colorful foods into our children. So things like sweet potato, greens, different kinds of fruits and vegetables, squash, things that are colorful. And so trying to get, these foods into their diet, and then trying to also decrease the processed foods and the soda and candy and chips and all these kind of things. So we're at about the midpoint, and just wanted again to remind you that we'll be offering, if you're interested, a no-charge phone consultation if you would like to talk with me personally about any health concerns that you have. So you can just call our office at 808-425-2987 and let our staff know that you're interested in a no-charge phone consultation. So I'd like now to move on from the what and the why to the how. So yeah, okay, most people know, okay, I should try to get my kids to eat more vegetables, but my kid won't touch a vegetable. Like, okay, how is that going to work? How is that even possible? And I work with a number of children with autism and special needs, and many of these children are extremely picky. I would say the most picky child that I've ever seen was a child with autism who literally only ate one food, and one food only. And that food was the chicharrones, those deep fried pork rinds. That was the one food that this child would eat, and nothing else. Literally, the child ate nothing else. Would drink juice and things like that, but wouldn't eat any other foods. So if your child eats more than that, then you're good, because that's the most extreme case of picky eating that I've ever seen. And we were able to help that child. The child's cholesterol was through the roof, really, really high. And so, of course, we had to work with the child to get the child to eat more than that. And we were able to get the child to slowly introduce other things. And I'm going to talk about that, a number of different tips and techniques and other things that could be helpful in terms of helping to improve your child's diet, and particularly if your child is a picky eater. So, first of all, there's a really good book that I like to recommend. It's called Picky Eating Solutions, and it's by a woman named Betsy Hicks, and she has a son with autism. And so she's really lived it in terms of having a child who was extremely picky, addicted to all kinds of processed and junk foods. And so she shares some great tips, and you can get her book on Amazon. Again, it's called Picky Eating Solutions by Betsy Hicks. But in her book, she talks about a number of tips and ideas. And so I'd like to talk about some of those things and just some other things that I found helpful in my own practice in working with patients. So one thing is she talks about in her book that, back in the day, there was no such thing as picky eating. Around the turn of the century, before the Industrial Revolution and all these things, where we had the advent of all of this processed packaged food, there was no processed food. So you had to eat whole foods in their natural form because that's all there was. And, back in the day, it was, when people lived on the farm and they didn't have picky eating because it was literally just, this is what you have to eat, and that's all we have in the house. And if you don't eat this, then there's not going to be anything else for you to eat. You're just going to go to bed hungry because this is the only food that we have. And now in our culture, in our American culture of abundance, and the grocery store is right around the corner, and there's so many different snacks and foods and everything that we can have in the house, we usually don't have that problem for most families. But there are so many parents who are afraid that if they take out, this food, that their child, only eats this and this food. I've had some children that will only eat grilled cheese sandwiches and will only eat mac and cheese and will only eat pizza, and that's the only thing that their child would eat. So there's different ways that you can work on that. There's some families that I've seen that have just done the, cold turkey, just take it out, stop buying it, don't have it in the house, and then it's just not there. And then just replacing it with healthier foods. And, if your child gets hungry enough, your child will eat. And so I've had some families where they just, like, this is all we have. And, if you're hungry, this is what you have to eat. So I've had some families who've used that approach. We can go several days without eating any food. I have had some children with autism who have gone several days without eating any food, but as long as they're drinking liquids, they'll be okay. I generally don't advocate the starvation approach, but I've had some families who have done that. Another approach is to just slowly introduce substitutes that are healthier, find ways to get things in that are healthier, but then just taking the junk food, especially things like the soda and the candy bars. And for a lot of families, if parents are addicted to those things, and it's like, oh, I can't take it out of the house and I can't have it to eat. But you just have to remember, of course, that if it's not good for your child, it's not good for you either usually. So just taking it out of the house and just not having it there. And then the whole family, if you're trying to get a healthier diet for your child, it's usually easier if the whole family is doing it. I just see a comment here from Jen. She says, my son has epilepsy and learning disabilities, so chicken and chips is all he wants most days, trail mix, cookies, Rice Krispie treats, but no veggies at all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips, Jen, to be able to help you too. Of course, trying to get more vegetables into the diet, whole organic meats, replacing candy with fresh fruit. So again, the how. A lot of kids, with all of our processed flavored foods, it's really hard to get vegetables into them. So one thing that I found helpful is the Sneaky Chef Cookbook. So if you've never heard about it, it's sneakychef.com. I don't have any financial connections with any of the books or the companies that I'm recommending. They're just things I found helpful in my practice. So the Sneaky Chef Cookbook was created by a mom whose kids would not eat vegetables at all. And so, so one thing that she would do is that she would make vegetable purees. And she's found a lot of recipes where you can make foods and then mix different kinds of vegetable purees into that food, where you can't really taste it that much, and it's a lot easier to get into kids. So one thing that she's done is that she will she'll make a whole bunch of vegetable purees ahead of time, and then you can pour it into ice cube trays and then freeze it. And then when you're making a soup or stew or stir fry or any other kinds of things, then you can just take out a cube and then pop it in and then just put it in there. Or you can put it into smoothies, things like that. So that's one thing that makes it easier. I generally recommend getting stainless steel ice cube trays. They do have them on Amazon and in other stores rather than the plastic ones. Because then it doesn't affect the taste that much if your child is extremely sensitive to taste and smell. And then also it's just better because it doesn't have the plastics. Because freezing and thawing plastics, some of the plastic will get released into the food. And there's a number of compounds in plastics that can actually be toxic. So that's one thing. So one thing is if your child will, eat things like spaghetti sauce or spaghetti, then you can puree mushrooms, onions, even greens. You can cook them and puree them and then pour them into ice cube trays and then pop out a few cubes and put it in like meatloaf or sauces or things like that. So Another thing that I've seen some families do in terms of cookies, like Jen, you mentioned your son will eat cookies. So the Sneaky Chef Cookbook has some resources. She has some cookie recipes on there where you can do vegetable purees and then put those in and bake them into the cookies or other kind of baked goods, muffins and things like that. That, you know, that's a way to start to get in some fruits and vegetables into your child. Um, some other kinds of things that I found helpful, kind of going back to what Betsy Hicks says in her book, Picky Eating Solutions. You know, if your child is only, you know, if your child is eating snacks throughout the day, then by the time your child gets to dinner time, they're not going to be that hungry because they've been snacking the whole day. So one tip that she gave is just to withhold snacks and just not give snacks, and then let them get hungry, and that's okay. We have this thing that, like, we feel like, oh, it's bad to let my child go hungry, but back in the day, of course, there wasn't any other option. And let your child get hungry for dinner so that when it comes time for dinner, that they're hungry and they'll be more willing to eat foods, you know, that that they usually aren't used to. So another tip is trying the this for that approach. So for example, if your child has a food that they really love, then getting them to just take like one bite, you know, of every meal. You introduce a food, and some people stick with the same food. Some people vary the different foods. But the thing is, like, you tell your child, okay, just take one bite of this other food. And, you know, if you know that your child really likes foods that are certain texture. For example, if your child really likes crunchy foods, then maybe you can get a vegetable or kale chips or taro chips or sweet potato chips, something that's crunchy and that has that same texture that your child likes. And then you just tell them, okay, you know, take one bite and then you can have this other food that you really like. So that's another tip that can be helpful, is saying, okay, take just one bite, and that every meal they have to take just one bite of a new food. There are some children, particularly children who have something called sensory processing disorder. So that texture issues can be a major issue for picky eating. That can be a big contributing factor. So in sensory processing disorder, it's sometimes also termed sensory issues. So in sensory processing disorder, people can be overly or undersensitive to certain types of sensory input. So for example, smells, textures, so touch, the way the food feels on their tongue, or they might be over or undersensitive to touch on their skin. They might be overly or undersensitive to sounds or to flashing lights. And and this is due to, it's not due to any problems with their actual sensory organs. So there's not a problem with their actual eyes or with their ears, you know, or their sense of touch in their skin with the touch receptors. There's not problems with the sensory organs themselves, but it's actually an issue with the way that the brain processes that sensory input. So the brain normally will process like a light touch as a light touch, but for someone with sensory processing disorder, a light touch may be interpreted as painful stimuli. And so for some people with these kinds of issues, they may actually be extremely sensitive to touch, and they may be very resistant to touch in certain parts of their body, on their hands or around their ears, you know, or they're very resistant to touch on their head. Or I see some kids who are extremely sensitive to sound. So the sound of a toilet flushing, particularly public toilets, because the public toilets tend to have a louder flush, terrifies them. And they, you know, like the sound of a flushing toilet may send them into a meltdown that lasts 30 to 60 minutes, where they're just screaming and crying, they're just inconsolable. I see other children who are extremely sensitive to other kinds of sounds, like the vacuum cleaner or, you know, the fire engine. Some kids who are sensitive to lights and things like that. And the way that this manifests with picky eating is that it can be a texture issue. So if your child is extremely picky and will only eat certain types of textures. So a common one that I see is that some of these kids will refuse to eat anything that's mushy. They won't eat any sauces. They will only eat plain chicken, no sauces, nothing on top of it, no soups, no stews, no pudding, no smoothies, like nothing that's mushy. But they will only eat crunchy foods, for example. So they'll only eat chips, or they'll only eat other kinds of crunchy foods. Or it might be vice versa. There are some kids who really like soft, mushy foods and who hate crunchy foods. And so if it seems like texture is the issue, then your child may actually have a sensory processing disorder, and that may need to be addressed through therapy, and I'll talk a little bit about those things. So sensory processing disorder can exist on its own, where a child only has sensory issues and no other issues. Sensory processing disorder, however, is also very, very common among special needs children. So children with autism, and sometimes children with Down syndrome, sometimes children with cerebral palsy, or other kinds of special needs. Sometimes children with ADHD may have sensory processing disorder that exists, on top of that. And so if your child really seems to be gravitating only towards foods with certain textures, and that's certainly something to consider, you may want to have your child evaluated for that. And the top place that I recommend in terms of evaluations is a place called Sprouts Therapy. They do occupational therapy, and they do have a feeding therapy program that I highly recommend for children with sensory issues. And they have a whole therapeutic approach that is based on that. So, but if your child, again, has issues, then some of the things that you can do is, trying to cater to that. If you know that your child will only eat crunchy foods and they're only eating potato chips, then, as I mentioned, you can try to make kale chips or taro chips or sweet potato chips, something that has that same texture but has a little bit more nutrition in it. And another thing is that if they have certain texture foods that they really like, using that as, again, the reward to try something else. In children with sensory processing issues, where the texture issue isn't a big thing, they may not be able to go straight to putting it in their mouth. And you may need to work up to that. So, for example, I have some kids that won't even tolerate the mushy food being on their plate. They'll just have a total meltdown. And so the first step is, okay, put it on your plate. Okay, and then when they can do that, then you reward them, and then you can give them the food that they really like. Once they can tolerate the food being on their plate, then you may give them, for example, then you have them put it on their fork, and then they put it back on their plate, and then you have them like touch it to their mouth and then put it back, and then you have them put it in their mouth and maybe they spit it out, but then you continue to reward them. And then the last step is actually putting their mouth and chewing it and then swallowing it. So you may have to build up to that, and the feeding program at Sprouts Therapy really builds on that approach. So if your child needs more steps like that, you may need to do something like that. So other things, even if your child doesn't have sensory processing disorder or sensory issues, a lot of kids are really addicted to juices or sodas, and they won't drink water. So one thing is just take out the juices, take out the sodas, just don't have it in the house. And water, like that's what your kid has. That's really what we should be drinking, is water. And so, if your child will get thirsty enough, they will drink water. There are some children who are extremely sensitive to taste, and that may not be an option for them. You might have to do a transitional type of approach. So for something that you can do is like you could do infused waters, where you have some fruits, where you put the fruits in the water, and then so there's some flavor, or maybe you add a little bit of honey, or fresh, squeezing a fresh orange or lime in there. Some children, you may have to transition them off of juice. You may have to water down the juice as a transition. So watering it down gradually until they get to the point that maybe they can drink a really diluted juice, and then transitioning to a naturally infused fruit-infused water, and then moving on to water. Other things that can be healthier, of course, in juice and soda. Milk is a good source of protein and calcium. Some children are adults too can't tolerate dairy, and so coconut milk, almond milk, other types of milk that are fortified with calcium, those are options as well. So some other types of things, if your child is addicted to sodas, these are some other options that you could try. So there's a soda called Zevia. It's Zevia, and it's a soda that is sweetened with stevia. So that's something that you might try. And another thing is there's something called Good Belly juice, which is actually juices that have probiotics in them, so at least there's some benefit with that. So you could try that. V8 Splash has some types that are vegetable juices mixed with fruit juices. You could also make smoothies or go to Jamba Juice where they have smoothies that will incorporate some vegetable juices or some veggies into there. You may also try, if your child is really addicted to sodas, if they really like the bubbly kind of thing, you might try water kefir. So that's something that is a fermented drink, and because it's fermented, it's naturally fizzy. So it has that bubbly kind of thing, but it's actually a good source of probiotics. So one common brand is something called Kevita, Kevita. And I've seen it at Safeway. I've also seen it at health food stores and some other places. It's in the refrigerated drink section by the kombucha. There are some children who will drink kombucha, but for a lot of other children, it's really hard to. The taste is too strong. But I find that water kefir is typically a lot easier to get into kids, and some of them are flavored naturally with fruit juices. So that's something that you could try as a replacement to soda. Another thing is that if your child won't drink the water kefirs, then you could try to add a little bit into, say, soda and then decrease the amount and then slowly go from there, until it's mostly water kefir. So that's something else, or just take the sodas out again. And so there's there's also, as I mentioned, some of the sensory issues. So some of the things that are done in the feeding program with Sprouts is that they actually play with the food. So getting the child, if they have a lot of sensory issues, getting the child to play with the food and to, so you might just take out the different foods that your child doesn't usually like, and then get them to, play with it, get a little play knife, allow them to cut it up, allow them to, put it in a blender and watch it blend up, allow them to put things together, make a little creation, and you can also involve them in your cooking. And if a child is helping with the cooking, then they may be more likely to actually eat that food. There's other kinds of things where you might, for example, have the child, play with the food and then sort them by color and then touch it and smell the foods and then ask them to tell you about that, what they feel or what they notice. If you have a child who has autism or other special needs where they're not verbal, then you can still have them play with their food and try to sort the foods by color where you're playing with it, and then have them play with it as well, where you're doing a type of parallel play where you can interact that way, and then they can get exposed to those foods, have them touch it, smell it, touch it to their mouth, and then the last step, of course, is to get it into their mouth. But sometimes playing with your food, having it separate from dinner time, but giving them an opportunity to play with the food and become more familiar with it, that can often be helpful. So these are just a few tips. There's a lot more, but these are a few of the tips that we had time to cover today. So there are definitely more issues and more things. Sometimes picky eating can sometimes be due to nutrient deficiencies. So a zinc deficiency, for example, can be something that can contribute to picky eating, because zinc is really important for proper taste of smell. And if you don't have proper sense of smell, then you're also not going to have the proper type of sense of taste. And so for someone who has a zinc deficiency, then foods may just taste or smell really bland. And so a good way to test that is through blood tests. I don't generally recommend, if your child is a picky eater, just going out and supplementing them with zinc, because it's possible that you can have unsafe levels of zinc as well. And so that's why I usually will do testing to figure out, does your child have a zinc deficiency, first of all? And then if they do, what level do they need to be able to address that? Again, because you don't want to just supplement them with zinc, because it is possible to give them too much zinc. And if you have too much zinc, that can actually cause problems with the sense of smell as well, and sense of taste. So it is important with zinc to get that tested first. Zinc and copper are two minerals that balance each other out. They're kind of like a seesaw. And so if you have too much zinc, then you can actually deplete levels of copper. So for that, again, it's important to test the levels of zinc before you just supplement them. But that could be one issue that you may want to look into. Another one is a magnesium deficiency. So if there's not enough magnesium, then that can sometimes lead to other types of sensory issues that could play into picky eating. So those are just two examples of things. Sometimes also, if a child is really, really refusing certain foods, and certain foods only, then it's possible that they may have an allergy or a sensitivity to that food. And so that's where food sensitivity testing or allergy testing can be helpful, because sometimes it's not just your child being picky, but it's because they actually have a sense that, when I eat that food, I don't feel good, so I don't want to eat it. And so that's where it can be very helpful to get testing done. And that's one of the things that I do, is I do test for food allergies, for food sensitivities, to try to figure out, okay, is that something that could be at play? Another reason that a child could be picky in terms of medical issues is that they may have acid reflux, where they have burning or pain in their esophagus as they swallow. And so especially if your child has a tendency to drink only liquids or softer foods and doesn't want harder foods or crunchy foods or anything that has kind of a rough texture, then that could actually be an issue. And there are many cases of silent reflux where a child may not say, oh, my throat hurts, my chest hurts. And some children who have lived with it all their lives, they don't realize that there's anything different. They may just think that's normal. So that's why they're not saying anything, because they just think that's normal. And they may not realize that, and you may not realize that either. This is particularly the case for children with autism or special needs who are nonverbal, or maybe they're verbal, but they don't have the ability to tell us, my tummy hurts, my throat hurts, my chest hurts. So that could be an issue. It could also be other kinds of digestive issues, where maybe a child has an ulcer, or a child could have inflammation in their gut, which is called colitis. And so then they really don't like eating foods because they have inflammation, so they don't feel good. Another reason is if a child is constipated, then they may eat only very small amounts of food and not have very much appetite because they're constipated, they're backed up, and they don't want to put more food in their system because they're backed up and they don't feel good. So these are all things to consider if your child is very picky, and that's why an appropriate medical intervention, if your child is extremely picky and these types of techniques are not working for you, those are certainly things to look at. And as I mentioned, Sprouts Therapy, I do recommend them. I've had a number of families go to them and really have only the most positive things to say about them. So again, they do have a feeding therapy program. Their website is sproutsTherapy.com. And I don't have any financial connections with them, and they're not paying me to say this, so just so you know. But I've just seen them really help a lot of families that have seen them. So, okay, that just about wraps it up. So mahalo for watching. And again, if you would like to arrange a personal no-charge phone consultation, it's really easy. Just call our office at 808-425-2987. Again, 808-425-2987. You'll find the contact information here on our Facebook page. And mahalo, we will see you in 2 weeks. Aloha.